So friends, in this part of the discussion, we move to the specific author of the English essay, the one who evolved this particular genre in the 20th century, in the 18th century, is Joseph Addison. And we have with us now once again Dr. Bajaj, who will tell us about Addison as an essayist, and particularly the title that he gave to the genre, Tatler. So what exactly is Tatler and why he calls it so? And is Tatler the essence of the English essay? And these things emerge, as kind of points of curiosity. So let's request Dr. Bajaj to enlighten us on this.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. So yes, the Tatler was actually launched in London by Richard Steele in 1709. Joseph Addison joined later this particular magazine and contributed regularly to it, writing over 40 essays for the magazine till the two jointly decided to bring out The Spectator, which is another magazine which came out in 1711. So I will be focusing today on Addison's contribution to the Tatler. Both the Tatler and the Spectator in fact became the model for English periodical writing. In fact, Samuel Johnson remarked about Addison's style in the Tatler that it was an English style that was familiar but not coarse, and he said, and elegant but not ostentatious. So the style of Addison in fact is what gave the Tatler also its distinct identity. From taking from Steele earlier to Addison, the style becomes more familiar and more colloquial, but it's not coarse. It is still elegant, but it's not pompous or ostentatious in its making. And clearly it shows that the vanity of the previous age has in a way been discarded by Addison in his characteristic style. So Addison actually chose to begin, even then Addison chose to begin, even Steele for that matter, the Tatler and the Spectator with a classical quotation. There would always be a quotation that he would use to just open the essay. So in a way that you can see that the influence of classical literature still remains and it is not entirely discarded, but it has made space for a more a kind of for the common people, I'd say, or the people who would easily understand it. It was not just for the aristocracy or the learned and the elite in the culture for whom it was addressed, even though you can see constant reference to classical texts in the works. Now Addison actually did not straight away go on to write essays. He actually earned the reputation by writing an epic poem called The Campaign. Again, Steele also, if we remember, wrote restoration comedies. So both these writers actually tried their hand at writing first literary texts. So Addison, in fact, when he wrote The Campaign, it was to celebrate England's win, and he was highly appreciated for it. He wrote a prose comedy as well, an opera, and a tragedy, Cato, for which he is really known. So before turning to the essay, he has written all these literary texts, and now he comes to writing the essay with that kind of a literary talent. So you can see how why the English essay also looks quite literary, because when the characters are formed, then the characters have that kind of a literary imagination. They carry the literary imagination of the writer, and they are not prosaic essays. They actually build a vivid portrayal of people, how they walk and what they say, and things get reflected, and the writer doesn't really have to say, but you find them amusing because you can already note these kind of eccentricities in characters that he talks about. Now, so the subject of these periodicals, and particularly Addison, what he tried to do was commenting on the manners of the time, and also commenting on the morals that people held, offering these lively portraits of very contemporary types. There would be a contemporary type that they would focus on and then build it. Like in one of his essays, he talks about the sonneteer. I'll come to that, I'll quote from it, and he goes on to talk about this contemporary type of a sonneteer who's writing poems, and one is reminded of again of Pope, who says shut, shut, shut the door, because there are all these poets and fledgling poets who want opinions, and they look for opinions from these literary giants. And again, this is a very contemporary type that he brings alive in his essay, in the form of how he met this man, how this man went on and on about his poems, etc. So all that. Then again, he builds another type. So there's also a coquette, there is a newsmonger, there is a virtuoso, there is a parson. So I'll take the case of a newsmonger and a sonneteer today, and give you a sense of how both these characters come alive in Addison's essay. But these are what I mean, that there are lively portraits, and these are all types. It's not to say that they are just individuals, they are types. Would you like to explain types to our viewers?
Types are those qualities in the character, and the character can also be called a type because it represents a large section.
Yeah.
So that section is in a way crystallized and compressed into an individual attitude, and that is what type is. But individual is one who can be separated from others and be asserted as a person who has something to say to another person. So that's how I interpret generally.
Right.
The
Yes.
two terms.
True. So in this case, then we have. Let me give you an example from the Tatler's issue now 155, which is where he's talking about the upholsterer. Now, this upholsterer, when he talks about is basically a newsmonger, and who's just going all over the places just to get some news. Now, this is again, if you remember, I've discussed this earlier, that how these essays, when they were written, we were told about the geography of the place, and we were told that any miscellaneous stuff that the writer wants to talk about, they say that the location of that place from where it is written would be my apartment. So this upholsterer essay is written from my apartment. Similarly, he said again, it was mentioned that if it's something that is of pleasure and entertainment, then it will be from the chocolate house, and if it is about poets and literature, then it will be from the coffee house. So we know that the moment you see the coffee house, you know what the subject is going to be like. So in a way, that's a very good division and sectioning. The moment you read from my apartment, it's just a kind of freewheeling sort of, and it's miscellaneous stuff that the writer is going to talk about. Anyway, so we are given the location from my apartment, and
but
then
the location actually determines the character.
Yes.
Very interestingly.
Yes. Go on. Why don't you explain that?
No, for instance, these places produce people, and those people behave in a very anticipatable manner. You can always anticipate what they are going to say, and that creates a sense of fun, a sense also of a connection between the ordinary reader and this type which is there in society.
Right.
So that's how I like to.
Yes, that's true. Because the moment you see the person, when he's in coffee house and he meets these characters, so there are particular types who would enter that coffee house. Again, as I said, fledgling writers and who vain characters, literary personas, etc. So you already know who you're going to meet in these places, right? So I think that's that. So the place itself has a character of its own. That's very rightly put. Now, let me take you to the quotation itself. Now, this newsmonger, how Addison begins, talking about how he introduces this character. Now, let me quote this from the essay, and he goes on, and I quote, "There lived some years since within my neighborhood a very grave person, an upholsterer, who seemed a man of more than ordinary application to business. He was a very early riser and was often abroad 2 or 3 hours before any of his neighbors." Now, you would think that, that this person is a very early riser, so maybe he's a very hardworking person and who rises before everybody else, and he's out of the house 2 or 3 hours before his neighbors even got up. So you have a sense that, okay, very virtuous, sort of very diligent and hardworking man. But what is this person doing? Look at this, and I quote further, "He had a particular carefulness in the knitting of his brows and a kind of impatience in all his motions that plainly discovered he was always intent on matters of importance."
Imagine.
Yes, yeah. So, upon my inquiry into his life and conversation, I found him to be the greatest newsmonger in our quarter.
One who is spreading news, one who is creating news.
Creating news, and who's also consuming news,
Yes.
right? That he rose before day to read the postman, and that he would take 2 or 3 turns of the other end of the town before his neighbors were up to see if there were any Dutch mails that came in, right? So you can already see that this man is doing the errands not for his business, for his work, etc., but to get news. He's trying to read the postman. He's trying to see if running around the town before his neighbors get up, so that he'll be the first one with the news, and to see if there were any Dutch mails that came in and could bring in some news of what's going on in other parts of Europe, and to get to read the postman before anybody else does, right? Now, he had a wife. Again, going back to the quote, he had a wife and several children, but was much more inquisitive to know what passed in Poland than in his own family, and was in greater pain and anxiety of mind for King Augustus's welfare than that of his nearest relations, unquote. Right? Yes, please comment.
Now, see the difficulty in his understanding. He wants to know pompous things, the big things, and he wants to avoid the rest of the things. So in a way, it's a kind of the person is not being ridiculed, but made fun of.
Yes.
And one can enjoy it, because in fact most of us would like to have this kind of combination of habits, and he has this habit of a newsmonger. So he's a true kind of a newsmonger, a true kind of a newsmaker, who is collecting news, who is composing that news inside his head, and later on he will regale people with his descriptions.
Right, right.
So
and his own discourse and his own understanding of how things go.
Yes.
So this is what happens in the course of this essay. In fact, we are told that this man completely lost track of his life, and he would, his children were in poverty and privation. This indefatigable kind of life that he led was the ruin of his shop, he says. And he says that, and all he thought of, and I quote, he says, he was in a great perplexity how to reconcile the supplement, that is the newspaper, the supplement, with the English Post, another newspaper, and had been just now examining what the other papers say upon the same subject. So he is looking at a news item in 3 different newspapers, collaborating them, and also finding gaps in them, and finding that one paper reveals something that the other hides, and then goes about, discussing, and as if it were a research point for him,
So that's how ideas are formed.
Right.
That's how opinions are made. That's how people are made to engage with the real issues of life. So through this kind of imaginative activity, you used the word creative earlier, it's very creative. With that, he is able to tell us that something very important is going on around us, and that is there at the level of the newspaper.
Right.
That he's making in his own mind.
Right. So again, if you notice that he's not saying that you should not read the newspaper or something, but he's talking about the obsessive nature of this man. So which leads him to extreme poverty. But because this man is obsessed with the political and military news from of the time, telling us that from Europe news is traveling. So this obviously talks about the curiosity of the time, and how people were hungry for news, for ideas, for what's for the current affairs. There's a sense of real desire to know and understand and to make sense of their times, and that I find very interesting in England at the time.
And this is a person. This is a character.
An ordinary. It's an upholsterer. You see, in the beginning, you mentioned how this particular essay talks about the common man, and the upholsterer is a common person. But again, this man, we are told that for though his wife and children were starving, I found his chief concern at present was for the great monarch. Unquote. So you can see that his wife and children are starving, but he's not bothered about family and other things. All he's bothered about is what's going on in world news, and so the writer actually joins him and a group of other people who they meet. He calls them politicians. He says these other politicians, they're all sitting at the upper end of a street, near he says at the Mall, which is like one of the streets of London, and they're basking in the sun, and then they are discussing international politics. And he notes that the chief, he says there was a chief politician on the bench, and who was a great asserter of paradoxes, right? So I think that Wayne itself, the way he brings these characters alive, that itself is very I think amusing and humorous, and taking a dig at all these people, but as you said, not ridiculing them per se. And he says that he had so many different points of views to add. He says that his assertions had so many broken hints, and it showed so much depth and wisdom that we all gave ourselves to his opinions. So in a way, I thought this is the age of public opinion, the making of public opinion, where peoples are constantly, engaging in debate, discussion, and shaping discourses of the time.
And at the level of ordinary things, for instance, it's nobody reading a book, nobody listening to a person from the pulpit, and there's no religious discourse that is being presented. It's all that people are just playing with one another, and here is a character who is looking critical at everybody and is saying something that may only interest him, but others are watching him, and that's how opinions are formed. And this is the 18th century essence.
Right.
Opinions are not formed through the classroom, through the church classes, Sunday classes. They are formed on the street itself.
Right.
So that's how England is emerging as a great nation. You used the word nation earlier.
Right.
I think that's quite pertinent.
Right. And towards the end, the writer then, he details this entire conversation around friends and all these participants who are politicians. But towards the end, the writer says, and I quote, the purpose of this essay, he says, and I quote, he says, "This paper I designed for the particular benefit of those worthy citizens who live more in a coffee house than in their shops, and whose thoughts are so taken up with the affairs of the allies that they forget their customers," unquote. Right. So this is written in 1710. So, the idea that there is always a purpose, there is a moral purpose behind why I'm writing this, that, think of your work, think of your job, right? Think of what you're supposed to do and not be obsessed with world affairs of the states or affair of the world, so much so that you forget your own customer, that your livelihood, in that sense. So again, I think it is also how how England is becoming, how England is creating its own citizens. Right, responsible citizens, worthy citizens, right? He says that it is for the benefit of those worthy citizens, which means that, again, the classical spirit, as I said, I'm reminded of the Republic in that sense, that what is it that you have to become responsible citizens. So even as that entire mode is discarded, but you see, the spirit of the classical period remains, that you must become rational, responsible, tempered sort of individuals, and that's what I thought.
I like the idea of republicanism that you are suggesting, through this kind of depiction of behavior of different people. Yes,
right. Yes. And the new culture for reading public, I found that very interestingly portrayed in this particular
which wasn't
essay.
The case in the 17th century.
Absolutely not, because there is only one person who's passing on this kind of knowledge. It's a very sort of didactic approach in one case, but also in a way deductive, in that sense that you already have a preconceived notion in your head, and you are the philosopher, guide, teacher, and you're out there to explain an issue, right? In this kind of an essay, there is a discourse that emerges, and because of character pen portraits, because each character is funny, but at the same time has a different mental makeup, has an idea and stands for a particular discourse, and then you don't know where this is going. It almost looks like even the writer doesn't know where it's going and decides to just stop somewhere, right? So in a way, you capture it you observe it, and then you reach a kind of a conclusion. So it's more exploratory, I think, and that is the spirit of the English essay. It doesn't seem to have a very preconceived notion of things. It seems to be exploratory in its approach, giving a very democratic feel to the whole essay, right? And that, I think,
and it entertains.
It entertains, and often obviously nudges an idler, for instance, in coffee house, who pays no attention to his responsibility as a family man or as a person who has job, etc. So I think that's what I find is very interesting about this essay. Now, as just a kind of just on the other side, right, where we had this newsmonger who was only about news and of politics and military, etc. He brings alive another character, Ned Softly, in his other issue, issue number 163 of The Tatler. Addison talks about this sonneteer, as I mentioned, right? Now, this is written from Will's Coffee House, again, because now the subject is going to be poetry and literature and poems. So the locale has also changed. It's no more an ordinary person, but somebody who is a sonneteer and who's vain, etc. Now it begins from a he gives you a quotation also from Catullus' poems, and the quotation, let me just quote what he says here, what he quotes over there. Of course it's in Latin, but the English translation of it I'll quote here. It says, "He is more clumsy than the clumsy country whenever he touches poetry, and at the same time he is never so happy as when he is writing a poem." You can see the paradox already. He is more clumsy than the clumsy country whenever he touches poetry, and at the same time he is never so happy as when he is writing a poem. He delights in himself and admires himself so much. True enough, we all are under the same delusion. Yeah, this is not the full quote, but I found this relevant for our discussion.
Individual detail, and the individual detail is then superimposed on the entire community of writers at that point in time.
So, and taking a quotation from a classical text, Catullus' poems, and then quoting it there, and to suggest that what is in store in this issue. Right, that he is going to talk about a man who is clumsy in writing poetry, but he is happy in writing poetry, and he delights himself and admires himself. So he is admiring his own self, and he says we can all be accused of the same delusion that we are all great poets.
And the greatness about him is that he doesn't rely on other people to appreciate him. He will appreciate himself.
Yeah. Right, and then he goes on to talk about, he says this is how he puts this quote that we are all under the same delusion, and then begins his essay. Now in the essay he tells us, and I quote, "I yesterday came hither about 2 hours before the company generally make their appearance." So he's in the coffee house and he's waiting for his fellow writers to join him, and he says, I was early, and he says, before others came in, I came here with a design to read over all the newspapers, right? But upon my sitting down, I was accosted by Ned softly, who saw me from a corner in the other end of the room, where I found he had been writing something.
So you move to the coffee house and you write your poem there.
Right. No, he says, I reached early the coffee house because I wanted to read the newspapers, and there came in this poet who's Ned softly, and he came and he was writing something and he saw me. And then he says, "Mr. Bickerstaff," says he, "I observe by a late paper of yours that you and I are just of a humour. For you must know, of all impertinences, there is nothing which I so much hate as news. I never read a gazette in my life, and never trouble my head about our armies, whether they win or lose, or in what part of the world they lie encamped." Without giving me time to reply, he drew a paper of verses out of his pocket, telling me that he had something which he would which would entertain me more agreeably, and that he would desire my judgment upon every line. For that we had enough time before us till the company came in. Right now, the idea is that unquote. Right, so he's building this kind of a character who's now just the complete opposite of a newsmonger, for instance. Now the newsmonger did nothing but carry news from every corner and was obsessed with that, and this character has nothing to do with news and says that I never bother myself with our armies or with the gazette, with the newspapers, and about whether we win wars or lose, because I'm always writing poetry, because I'm a true poet. Right, so I think I found that very interesting. What do you say?
Of course, these are the characters that are produced by that society which believes in mercantilism. So you have your own, capital, you have your own shop, and you have to sell it. And therefore, the first thing that you think of at that point of time is that you write a poem, and then you like admirers for it. So he'll ask people to come and appreciate it, and then he wants to see the appreciation in each line. So he reads the line, he must be looking towards the person, am I not great? And that person has to nod, then he can go further. And this kind of a character is not possible in the 17th century, because there are no poets of that kind. Only aristocrats wrote poetry in the 17th century. But here you have a person who also has, some kind of a scheme to become a great poet like Catullus and all. And I think we all wish him luck for that reason, because these people are prospering in England at that time. Pope, as you rightly said in the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, England was at that time full of such,
Budding writers.
such writers.
Yeah. So in a way, what I found was that, again, the writer here, in this case, of course, he's using the pseudonym of Bickerstaff, which is what the Tatler's writer took. This was the pseudonym that.
See the name. He was all the time bickering.
Yeah.
So that's his name.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. So in a way, I felt that, what here the writer was trying to target was any kind of extremity. In one case you have this extreme case of a newsmonger, and in the other case you have this extreme obsessive vain poet who is a sonneteer. So I think that he was trying to target any kind of extremity through these English essays, and that I found interesting. Now this in the case of this person who's Ned Softly, he's any English reader of the time, who thinks he's going to become as great as Shakespeare maybe, or who thinks that he has everything in him going to be the greatest English poet of the time, admired by his contemporaries, etc. So I think there is this sense of there is a sense of critique offered of any kind of extremity that you see around by the essayist, and of course you create this kind of a wonderful sort of caricature in some sense, I would say, of these characters. Yeah.
Yes, of course, that is right, but we are at the end of our discussion. So, Dr. Richa Bajaj has given you a glimpse of the 18th century cultural life, and the way the English essay was being forged in the hands of different writers, and later on, as we will come to know, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, there will be novel writing, and all these characters will reappear there and in a specific context. So that's how rich it is. And Dr. Bajaj has given us a true picture of this kind of a forging of the English essay in the 18th century. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.